Hello and welcome to another session of Excel programming for clinicians with me, Dolotson Callum. In this session, we will get into the power of loops. Specifically, we will work with the for next loop and the for each loop. We will first look at what you need to do if you had to write the same code over and over again but couldn't use loops. We will then look at the for next loop and how this helps us avoid repetition. We will then look at how to skip some loops in the for next loop and maybe complete an action every 2 or 3 or even n number of loops. We will then take a look at how to loop backwards in the for next loop. And next, we'll look at how and why you want to nest one for next loop inside another one. After all that, we'll take a look at another type of loop, the for each loop, and understand when we use the for next and when we use the for each. Finally, we'll take a look at how to exit a for loop before it has completed all of its iterations. Okay, so before we take a look at the for next loop or the for each loop, let's first see what it would be like to try to write the same code over and over again without using loops. So we're going to use a scenario of some laboratory results which have just come back to us, and we're going to have to decide whether or not to book an appointment for our patient. So we've got here some white blood cell counts, and we have to decide whether or not to book an appointment for our patient. So let's start without loops. So we need to declare a variable to hold our white blood cell count. I'll declare that as a single. So I want to get the white blood cell count from Excel, and then I want to test the value. And if the value is less than 1.5 or it's greater than 30, I want to book an appointment for that particular patient. So with our white blood count variable, we'll use the cells object, and we'll go to row 16 and column 3, which is column C, and we'll grab the value. With that value, what we want to say is if that white blood cell count is less than 1.5 or white blood count is greater than 30, then we want to do something. I'll put my end if, and then what we want to do is we want to select cells, and I'll provide it the row, and this time I'll provide 4 for the column. So I'm selecting row 16, column D. And then with that selection, I want to set the value to book appointment. So if my white blood count is less than 1.5 or greater than 30, then I run the code. I select cell D16, and then I set the value to book appointment. And obviously, if it's not, then I leave that alone. Okay, so now I have the code to determine whether my first patient has a white blood count either below 1.5 or above 30, and if they do, I'll book an appointment for that patient. I now need to do the same for the remaining 9 patients. So let's copy that code. Let's paste it down, and let's change this to 17. Paste it again, and this time choose row 18. And we'll keep doing that till we have all 10 patients. Okay, so now we have code to determine for each of our 10 patients whether or not their white blood cell count is below 1.5 or above 30, and if it is, we book them an appointment to come and see us in clinic. Let's run the code and see what we get. So as you can see, for patients 2, 4, and 6, they meet our criteria for booking an appointment, and our code works as expected, and we have booked appointments for those 3 patients. So great, that works, but the problem with this is that we have to copy and paste the same code over and over again. Now that's okay when you only have 10 patients, but what if you had 100? What if you had 1,000? Copy and pasting the same code over and over again is never a good idea. It will be very easy to make a mistake, put the wrong value in the cells you want to select, and then your code ends up doing something unexpected. The other problem with this code is, what if we introduce a new criteria? What if we said, for instance, everybody below 1.5 should get an appointment booked, but everybody above 30 should have a super urgent appointment booked? Then we have to rewrite the code not once, but 10 times potentially. And if you had 100 patients, you'd have to write the code 100 times. So it's never a good idea to repeat the same code over and over again. The way to improve this code is to use loops. Let's take a look at the for next loop. A for next loop allows us to set a range from a minimum to maximum and then run a block of code X number of times, where X is the difference between the start of that range and the end of that range. Let's take a look at the structure of a for next loop. First, we'll declare a variable to hold our white blood cell count. And then we'll declare a variable as a counter within our loop. We write a for loop like this. For our counter variable equal to the start to the end of our range, we want to run a block of code, and then at the end of each block of code, we want to go to the next value of I. So the first time we run through this loop, I will be equal to 16, and then we'll get to the end, and then we'll go to the next value of I, which will be 17, and then the code would run again, and it will keep doing that over and over again until I is equal to 25. Once I equals to 25, we'll exit out of the for loop and then end our procedure. So what do we want to run inside our loop? Let's copy this code that we wrote earlier and put it inside our loop. And let's change some values. Instead of choosing row 16, we want to choose row, whatever the value of I happens to be. So we'll change 16 to I. And I want to put the answer into column E, so I'll put that as 5. So what we're saying here is that the first time we run through, I will be equal to 16, so we'll choose row 16, column 3, and we'll get the value of the white blood cell count. We'll do our if statement and check the value of I. If I is less than 1.5 or greater than 30, then we'll book an appointment. If not, we'll go to the next value of I, which will be 17. Let's put a breakpoint here and run our code and see what we get. So before we start our loop, I is equal to 0, which is the default value of integer variables. When we step into the code, I is now equal to 16. So we'll get the value of white blood cell count for row 16, column 3, which is our first patient. And then because that value is not less than 1.5 or greater than 30, we do not run the program in our if statement, and we go to the end of our if. And then we get the next value of I. I is now equal to 17. And this time, when we get the value of the white blood cell count, it's 1.3, which is less than 1.5, and so we step into our if statement. And we write the value, and this time we book an appointment. And so if we remove the breakpoint, we can run the code to the end. And as you can see, as before, we have booked 3 patients in to come and see us, and we've only had to write the block of code once. Now, the beauty of writing the code this way is that if our rules change, we only have to change the code once. So for instance, if we now need to book super urgent appointments for anybody with a white cell count below 1.5, we can copy and paste that code and then edit it. So if my white cell count is less than 1.5, I want to do one thing, else if white blood cell count is greater than 30, then I want to do this. So I can very quickly change my code. So if the white tail count is less than 1.5, I book a super urgent appointment. Else if it's greater than 30, I just book a normal appointment. Otherwise, I don't book an appointment at all. Let's run this updated code and see what we get. And as you can see, when my white cell count is below 1.5, I book a super urgent appointment. If it's above 30, I just book a normal appointment. And again, below 1.5, I book a super urgent appointment. Next, let's take a look at running the for next loop with a step. What I want to do is run a for next loop, but I don't want to take action on every iteration of the loop. I just want to take action on every second iteration of the loop. Let me demonstrate. I'll declare a variable I as a counter for my loop. And then I'll say for I equal to 16 to 25. I want to run some code, and after each loop, I want to go to the next I. But I don't want to run the code on every iteration. I want to do the code in steps of 2. For every second iteration through the loop, I want to run this block of code that I'm about to write. So what I want to do is use the cells object, use row I, column 2, and I want to set the font color to red. I also want to set the cells I to set the font style to bold. So I'm targeting column 2 here, which is the column that has my patient IDs. But I only want to take action on the second iteration. Let's run the code and see what happens. As you can see, on the second loop, I have highlighted my cells and changed the fonts to red. Next, we'll look at the for next loop, but running in reverse. Now, there may be some times where you want to run a for next loop, but you want to start at the end of your sequence and run all the way back to the beginning. Let's take a look at how to do that. Let's declare a variable I to use as our counter. Let's also declare a variable for white blood cell count. Now, the way you write a for next loop running in reverse is similar to a normal for loop with an additional step. Let me demonstrate. So you start at the end of your sequence and you run to the beginning, and then you say you want to run in steps of -1. And then you close out your loop with a next iteration. And you write your code as normal. I'll use the cells object, setting the row to I and the column to 3, and I'll get the value. With that, I'll then use a if statement to check the value of my white blood cell count. And if it's less than 1.5 or greater than 30, then I want to take some action. And I'll close out my if loop. And the action I want to take is I want to select the cell, and with my selection, I want to set the value. Okay, so it looks like a normal for next loop, except I'm using step -1 and I'm starting at the end and looping to the beginning. Let's set a breakpoint, and run the code and see what we get. So as I step through the code, you can see that I starts off at 25. And as I loop through, next I now equals 24. So the value of I steps down by 1 as it goes through the loop. And as I step through, each time, it runs the code if I is less than or equal to 1.5 or greater than 30. This time I is greater than 30, and so it enters a value. And we exit the loop when I is less than 16. And that is how we run the for next loop in reverse. Next, let's look at the nested for next loop. To demonstrate the nested for next loop, I will declare two variables to use as counters. I'll declare variable I, and I'll declare another variable j. As usual, I'll declare a variable to hold my white blood cell count. What I will have is an outer loop and an inner loop. My outer loop will be based on I. For each value of I want to get the white blood cell count. So I'll use my cells object and I'll grab the value from the third column. Then with that value, and I want to run an inner loop. So I'm setting the inner loop to run from j equals to 4 to j equals to 6. And now I can select a cell using my variables I and j. So I'll select the ith row and the jth column. So the first time I step into this, I will be equal to 16 and j will be equal to 4. The second time I loop through the inner loop, I will still be equal to 16, but j will be equal to 5, followed by I equal to 16 and j equal to 6. Once I've finished looping through all the values of j, I'll then go back out to the outer loop and I becomes 17. And j then starts at 4 again. Let's set the value of that selection object. Let's step through this code and check the values as we run it. So the first time I run, I is equal to 16. J is not yet set. I get the value of my white blood cell count, and I set J equal to 4. So now I'm selecting the cell that is in row 16 and column 4. And I can set the value. And then I loop through my inner loop, and now J becomes 5. And I can set the value of the 16th row and the 5th column. And I loop again. And I've finished now looping through all the values of J from 4 to 6. And then I can go to the next value of I. In this case, I then becomes 17. J resets to 4. And so I select the 4th column in the 17th row. And I set the value. And I loop through my inner loop again. And I go back to the outer loop. and I equals 18. And that continues until I equals 25. If I run the code to the end, you can see how you can use an inner loop and an outer loop. Okay, so far we've concentrated on the for next loop. Next, let's take a look at the for each loop. The for next loop is used mainly to loop through a known set of values. The for each loop, on the other hand, is mostly used to loop through collections of objects. Let's take a look. I'll declare a variable to hold my white blood cell count as normal. And I'll declare a variable this time that's of type range. So it's a type of object. We've used a range object before. So now I'm declaring a variable called cell, but I'm setting the type to range. Now let's use our range object. Select cell C16. So that selects this cell. Now I want to select the range of cells going downwards that has the values of my white blood cell counts. To do that, I'll use the range object and the active cell object as the first cell in the range, and then active cell.end selecting downwards as my end object. Then I'll select that whole range. Now I can loop through that range using a for each loop. I can say for each cell in my selection, do something and then go to the next cell. So here I'm looping through a range of objects as part of my for each loop. As before, I can now access values. So using my cell variable that I declared earlier, but because I declared it of type range, it now has a value property like any other range object. So I can get the value of my cell and put it in the white blood cell count variable. Then I can use my if statement to check my white blood cell count. And if my white blood cell count is less than 1.5 or greater than 30, I can use my cell variable that I declared. Remember, it's of type range, so it will have an offset property. So I can offset by 0 rows and 3 columns and select. That way, when I'm on the 16th row, I will select column F of row 16. And so with my selection, I can set the value property. Okay, so now I'm not setting an I variable to say run from 25 to 16. I might not even know how many columns, how many rows have got data, but my for each loop allows me to write it code in such a way that it doesn't matter that I don't know where it ends or where it starts. As long as I can select a range, I can loop through that selection. Let's run the code and see what we get. And the code works as we would expect. As with our for next loop, we can write any variation of our if statement within our for each loop. So as before, I can declare my for each loop and set my white blood cell count to be the value property of my cell variable. And I can check my white blood cell count And I can then have an else if condition. And if I copy this code here, I can then change one of these to an urgent appointment. Okay, let's run this code and see what we get. And as you can see, when my condition for white blood cell is less than 1.5, I can book a super urgent appointment. And then when it's above 30, I can book just a normal appointment. Finally, let's take a look at how to exit a for loop. Now, there may be some times where you're looping through your objects and you might decide that based on a particular condition, you want to exit the for loop and not continue to run. Let's take a look at how to write that. Let's say you have these list of patients, but you can only book 2 appointments on a given day. So you want to loop through these white blood cell counts, and if the cell count is less than or equal to 5 or greater than 30, you want to book an appointment, but you only want to book 2 appointments, and anything after that will have to be pended for another day. This is a classic example of when you might want to exit out of a for loop earlier than getting to the end of the loop. Let's see how we write that. So let's declare a variable for our white blood cell count. Let's declare a variable to hold our cell. We'll declare it as type of range. And let's declare another variable for number of appointments. Okay, let's start with the number of appointments set to 0. Let's select cell C16. And let's select the range of cells going downwards. So we want to for each through this selection. We want to get the white blood cell count. And we want to use our if statement to check the white blood cell count. But before we do anything, we want to check if the number of appointments is greater than or equal to 2. If it is, then we want to exit the for loop. So if the number of appointments is greater than or equal to 2, we want to exit the for loop. Otherwise, we want to do our cell offset. And we want to book our appointments. And then the most important step, if the number of appointments wasn't equal to 2, we've added a new appointment. So now we need to increment the number of appointments. We say number of appointments is equal to whatever it currently is plus 1. So each time we add a new appointment, we increment the number of appointments variable by 1. So that way, at some point, number of appointments might be equal to or greater than 2, in which case we exit the for loop. Let's put a breakpoint and run the code and see what we get. So number of appointments is currently equal to 0. We step through our collection using our for each loop. And for the first time, we have a value that's less than 1.5. And so we step into the if statement. We then check the number of appointments, which is equal to 0. So we do not run the exit for. Instead, we book an appointment. But crucially, number of appointments still equal to 0. We therefore make it equal to 0 plus 1, which is then 1. And then we go to our next cell. We check white blood cell count again, and if it's not within the specified range, we do not run the code inside the if statement, and we loop again. Now we've come to another row where white blood cell count is greater than 30. So we check our number of appointments. It's currently just 1. So we do not run the exit for. Instead, we keep going and we book another appointment. And we increment the number of appointments to 2. And then we run around again. Next cell. And we hit another one where the white blood cell count is less than 1.5. But this time, because the number of appointments is already equal to 2, and we can only manage 2 appointments in a day, we run the exit for loop, and we terminate. So the exit for is a really useful way of exiting a for loop based on a condition. So that was a really quick introduction to the for next loop and the for each loop. Both are very powerful and very useful ways of running code without having to write the same thing over and over again. Instead, you run from the start of a range to the end of a range, whether that be a range of numbers with a for next loop or a selection of rows or columns with a for each loop. Okay, I hope you found that useful and interesting, and I will see you in the next video.